Habits. When I say the word, sometimes we have an automatic reaction that's both good and bad. But simply, habits are rituals and practices, behaviors we perform automatically. They allow us to carry out essential activities and follow the same routes every day without thinking about them. Do you ever find yourself doing something like this? Invariably, if we have to go anywhere, my GPS says, okay, get on Schweitzer, go north, turn right at 119th, catch 69, and then it's to wherever we're going. And so Sue and I are driving along Schweitzer, and I just keep right on going past 119th because I'm going to the church. My body says this is where you go. And it ignores that, and you go, okay, now I got to turn around and do all this and do that. But that's what happens with a habit. It becomes unconscious. You don't have to think about it. That's actually kind of a good thing. It frees up resources for our brains. We don't have to be concerned with trying to remember every little detail. Can you imagine trying to learn almost you're tying your shoes over every day? Okay, I do turn the loop and I do this. I'd have a hard time. We all have habits. But habits can be divided into three groups. The first group's those habits we don't notice because they've been part of us for as long as we can remember. Maybe it's brushing our teeth, tying our shoes, anything like that. The second one are habits that we know are bad for us, like smoking, procrastinating, overspending, overeating, all those lovely things that we try to change. But the final group is those habits that are good for us and which we work hard on establishing. Things like exercising, eating well, getting enough sleep. But how do you get good habits to take root in your lives? How do you finally get something that's good for you to happen on a regular basis? The answer is in the sermon title, and it is, boy, I tell you, they're weak. I should have practiced. I know. I mean, can you imagine? How would you like to have come in this morning, choir, and never having seen that anthem before, had it handed to you, and Rebecca said, okay, we're going to sing this right now, no practice. I'm watching Rebecca's face just fill with fear and anguish at the very thought of it. No practice? None? Because you don't get sounds like that without practice. You don't get a lot of good things to happen in your life without practice. As the letter to the Philippians pointed out, there are some important habits we need to adopt if we want to follow the pathway of Jesus Christ. Be glad in the Lord always. Let your gentleness show in your treatment of all people. Don't be anxious about anything. Bring up all your requests to God in your prayers and petitions along with giving thanks. Now, one of those is pretty hard, I know. That's don't be anxious about anything. Everyone has a little anxiety, it seems. Let your gentleness show in your treatment of all people. We'd like to think we can do that. But there are a lot of other things that are involved in being a good Christian that require us to do practice. We call them spiritual disciplines or spiritual practices. It's just developing certain behaviors into a really good habit. But the result of doing these things is what I think most of us would consider a blessing. The peace of God that exceeds all understanding. It's that shalom that we read about in the Hebrew Scriptures, the peace that my daughter mentioned last week in her sermon, that is more than just an absence of violence. It's the presence of wholeness, of justice. All that comes from being at peace with yourself and with those around you. But it's not always an easy thing to do. It's that kind of peace you need to do if you want to do the really hard work of Jesus. And there is some hard work. Just like the choir has to practice to be able to sing that, I'd say that we have to practice too to be able to do things like, show gratitude, kindness, be able to pray on a regular basis. Probably most important of all, though, forgiveness. Probably the number one teaching of Jesus that's shown throughout the Gospels, and yet I would say is the hardest one for us to do, and probably the one most of us would like to say, okay, there's got to be something else that comes before that, right? because forgiving, that's a little hard for us. Few of us have prepared ourselves for really difficult situations where forgiveness is required at a level we don't think about. We wrestle with forgiveness in small things. But unless we make a habit in all aspects of our lives of learning to forgive, we can't hope to forgive when other people and ourselves need it most. I'll give you a couple examples. Consider the forgiveness it takes in the face of extreme violence. Look at the congregation of Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church. Dylan Roof, a 21-year-old white supremacist, murdered 9 African Americans, including the senior pastor, during a prayer service at the church in downtown Charleston, South Carolina, the evening of June 17th, 2015. 3 other victims survived. But the morning after the attack, after police arrested Roof in Shelby, North Carolina, well, just 3 days after that, a young man by the name of Chris Singleton said this: "We already forgive him for what he's done, and there's nothing but love from our side of the family." His mother was Sharonda Coleman Singleton, who'd been one of the victims. Many other relatives and friends of the 9 church members slain offered Roof forgiving words. Or 13 years ago, October 2006, a gunman barricaded himself inside a one-room Amish schoolhouse near Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and then opened fire. Charlie Roberts killed 5 children, injured 5 others before killing himself. The Amish community responded in a way that I know a lot of people found surprising. We weren't living far away at the time, and we were stunned because they forgave the shooter immediately. And in the years since, they've grown close to his family. As I turned on the radio on the way there, the newscaster was reporting that there'd been a shooting at the local Amish schoolhouse, said Terry Roberts. By that time, I was at my son's home, and I saw my husband and the state trooper standing right in front of me as I pulled in. And as I looked at my husband, he said, "It was Charlie. I'll never face my Amish neighbors again." That week, the Robertses had a private funeral for their son. But as they went to the gravesite, they saw as many as 40 Amish start coming toward them from around the side of the graveyard, surrounding them like a crescent. Love just emanated from them, Terry said. I do recall the father saying, "I believe that I have forgiven, but there are some days when I question that." I'll never forget the devastation caused by my son, said Terry. But one of the fathers the other night said, none of us would have ever chosen this, but the relationships that we built through it, you can't put a price on that. And their choice to allow life to move forward was quite a healing balm for us, Terry said. And I think it's a message the world needs. It helped her to resolve her own struggle to forgive her son. Terry said, if they can forgive my son, do I forgive my son? I was so angry with what he'd done, and yet the realization that if I chose not to forgive him, I would have the same hole in my heart that he had. Less than a year after she'd made those statements, Terry Roberts died following a battle with cancer. I will add as a footnote that forgiveness did not come easy to those Amish families. Don't sit there and think to yourself, oh, well, they're different than we are. They live a different lifestyle, so it's easier for them. There are still members of that community receiving professional counseling and therapy, but while they struggle, they still strive to do that forgiveness on a daily basis. Do we think any one of us could extend that kind of forgiveness facing a similar situation? Talking with a couple gentlemen afterwards, we talked about if anything happened to our children, what would we think about? What would we do? I tell you, when I hear stories like that, that's one of the first things that comes to my mind. What would I be able to do if that was my kid? I can't imagine the pain like that experienced by people. And I can't imagine being able to forgive that quickly. But I also recognize that that doesn't just happen. No more than anything else that's really good in life just happens out of nowhere. It takes practice. It takes working at it continually, seeking to forgive others in much less challenging situations. If I don't do that, I guarantee I will fail. Not only myself, but Jesus, who commanded his followers to forgive. And he didn't say just the big things or just the little things, to forgive always. If you were driving down the road and somebody cut you off, would you forgive them immediately? I said that this morning, and amazing the many smiles at the very thought of it, because they thought to themselves, no. But you know, one of the things that somebody taught me was you have to sit there and think of things differently. I mean, immediately you see somebody cut you off and they're racing off down the road, and maybe your mind says, well, I can't believe they did that. Except maybe that was somebody taking a pregnant wife to the hospital in a hurry, or an injured child. And if you knew that, wouldn't you feel horrible? Maybe it's the way we treat each other and the assumptions we make about the reasons behind people doing things. I think Jesus wanted us to forgive first, not to sit there and try and figure out the reasons why somebody might be doing things as if they have to justify themselves to us, but our job is to forgive. Forgiveness, compassion, gratitude. Those are just a few of the attributes that we're supposed to exhibit as followers of Jesus Christ. Not maybe. I mean, honestly, if you go out and feed the hungry, and if you take care of visiting the poor and going to visit those in prison and heal the sick, but you can't show forgiveness to people, and if you can't show compassion or gratitude in your daily life, if you can't do any of those things, maybe it hasn't taken place in your heart. Maybe you haven't let the forgiveness of God come into your own heart. Those attitudes don't just happen in a vacuum either. I mean, I can imagine a hermit saying, well, I'm filled with compassion for other people, and I'm a very forgiving person. Of course, I live in the middle of nowhere, and I never see anybody, so I found it really easy to be forgiving if you don't deal with people. Just stay away from people, and you'll never have to worry about being forgiving. But it doesn't work that way. All the things we're called to do, all the teachings of Jesus Christ are about living in a community. Those attitudes don't just happen. They're shown by us within a community, the church, so that hopefully we go outside the church into the community with those types of attitudes. It takes practice and it takes support. You, me, all of us working together to encourage each other, to guide each other on a path that is only taught by Jesus Christ. It's not only our children we help to grow in the faith when we come to church. I think too often we think, we come to church and we help our children grow and learn more about their faith. And, we come, and if we do Bible study, that's just because it's a mental exercise we like to do. And we like to look at the different words in Hebrew, what they mean, and those types of things. When the reality is we come to church so that we help encourage each other to practice those things. We have a new group, the runners. How well does that work if you skip all that? We have a 30-day plan. Now, what happens if you try and do that thing at the end without any of that work in between? Not going to go very well. You might get about 500 feet before you realize I'm in trouble. In describing this kind of work that we're supposed to do, New Testament scholar Michael Gorman wrote, with the Spirit's help, it's not as difficult as it might appear. First of all, work at caring for one another and find unity in your own congregation, and then it will spill out into other contexts. Now, I have to admit, I have a selfish reason for talking about this message. It's because I believe that's the kind of church people want to find. I hate to say this, but if you have a church with the church could have the most wonderful music in the world. You could have the most fantastic preacher standing up on a Sunday morning, eloquent, filled with fire and humor and everything else, and if when you get to the end, there's no forgiveness and there's no compassion, and like they said in Corinthians, it's no more than a banging gong or a clanging cymbal. There is no love. I believe people want to find a place of acceptance, a place where one finds forgiveness, where compassion is more than just a word, a place where in the middle of a world that seems filled with chaos and upheaval, you can find peace. A place where we put our salvation into practice in our daily lives and people experience the love of Jesus Christ. I'm going to test your levels of forgiveness. Think to yourself, a child suddenly runs up and down the center aisle here during the anthem or during the sermon. Do you forgive that child right away? Or do you sit there and think to yourself, I wish somebody's parent would get up and take care of them? Or here we go. What if somebody spills coffee? Somebody brought coffee into the sanctuary and spilled it on the carpet. Will your first reaction be to forgive them? I'd like to hope so. Those are the little things. If we can't do the little things, how are we ever going to do the big things? It sounds hard, because it is. But everything worth doing is worth doing well. I believe that at times we are the kind of community here. But we're also human beings, which means we are going to fall down. We're going to backslide. Otherwise, why would any of us need forgiveness in the first place? We're human beings. It's going to happen. But what happens is we seek forgiveness not only for ourselves, but for each other. We work on it together to lift each other up. And all you can do is practice it, practice it, practice it until it becomes a habit. And not because it's what I preach, but because it's what Jesus teaches. Amen.